John lay awake in the suffocating stillness of his cramped Chicago apartment. The faint hum of the L train rattling through the walls. The dim flicker of a neon sign outside cast jagged shadows across the room, where his kids, Ethan, 12, and Sophie, 7, slept soundly. Their soft breathing was a lifeline, but it couldn't drown out the storm raging in his chest. Months. That's all the doctors had given him. Terminal cancer, they'd said, their voices flat, their eyes avoiding his. He hadn't told the kids yet. How could he? Ethan, with his quiet strength, and Sophie, her wild curls spilling over her pillow, had no clue their world was about to shatter. John's fists clenched as he stared at the ceiling, the weight of his secret pressing down like a vice. He'd fought battles before, grueling factory shifts, nights without food to keep theirs on the table. But this was a war he couldn't win. The clock ticked louder, each second a gunshot in the silence, counting down to the day he'd leave them defenseless. His gaze drifted to Ethan's worn-out boots by the door, Sophie's little bear clutched tight in her arms, pieces of a life he was about to abandon. Fear clawed at him, raw and relentless. He wasn't just dying, he was failing them. But then a spark ignited in the chaos of his mind. One last chance to give them something unbreakable, a memory to cling to when he was gone. Time was a thief, and it was closing in fast. John's hands trembled as he sat at the chipped kitchen table, the flickering fluorescent light overhead buzzing like a swarm of angry bees. Outside, the Chicago wind howled, rattling the cracked window panes as if the city itself was closing in on him. The blank sheet of paper in front of him stared back, mocking his silence. He gripped the pen tighter, his knuckles whitening. Time was slipping through his fingers like sand, and this was his last shot. The doctor's words echoed in his skull. Months, maybe less. Cancer was a ruthless bastard, chewing through him faster than he could fight back. But this wasn't about him anymore. It was about Ethan and Sophie, his kids, still dreaming in the next room, oblivious to the guillotine hanging over their little family. He'd promised them a trip to Lake Michigan's shores, golden sand, crashing waves, a day where the world didn't feel so damn heavy. It was a dream he'd clung to through every double shift at the steel mill, every skipped meal to pay the rent. Now, it was all he had left to give them. One final blazing memory to hold when the darkness took him. His chest tightened as he traced the edge of the paper, the weight of his love for them crushing him. Ethan's lopsided grin after scoring a goal, Sophie's giggles as she danced in the living room. Those were the pieces of himself he couldn't let die. But money? That was a pipe dream. The rent was overdue, the fridge nearly empty, and a trip to the lake might as well have been a flight to the moon. Still, he couldn't let go. He wouldn't. This wasn't just a vacation. It was a lifeline, a desperate plea to etch his love into their souls before the clock ran out. The pen hovered, shaking. How do you cram a lifetime into a few words? How do you beg the universe for one last miracle? He scribbled, scratched out, started again, each line a jagged piece of his breaking heart. My kids deserve this. I'm running out of time. Please. The words blurred as tears hit the page, his breath hitching. He couldn't afford to fail them now, not when every second was a countdown to goodbye. A creak snapped him out of it. Ethan shuffled in, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his too big Bulls jersey hanging off his skinny frame. Dad, what's wrong? His voice was small, but his gaze pierced through John like a blade. John forced a smile, ruffling his son's hair. Just dreaming, buddy. What if we hit the lake? Made that trip happen? Ethan's eyes lit up, then dimmed. We can't afford it. The truth hung there, brutal and cold. John's throat burned. He was out of moves, out of time, unless fate had one last card to play. And it was about to. Hey, you! Did this hit you in the feels? Drop a 1 in the comments and smash that subscribe button to see if John pulls off this miracle, or if it all crashes down. Not feeling it? Hit the like button anyway and tell us why. Want to know who steps in to flip this story upside down? Stick around. Part 3's coming, and it's going to blow your mind. Share this with your crew if you're rooting for John, Ethan, and Sophie. Let's see how far this fight goes. The dim glow of the laptop screen cast harsh shadows across Ethan's face as he sat hunched on the sagging couch, the Chicago night pressing against the windows like a living thing. The apartment was silent except for the relentless drip of a leaky faucet and the faint groan of the L train rumbling past. His fingers hovered over the keys, trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. John had crashed early, his breathing ragged from the cancer eating him alive, leaving Ethan alone with the truth he couldn't unsee. The hollows under his dad's eyes, the way his hands shook when he thought no one noticed. Sophie slept in the next room, clutching her bear, still blissfully unaware. But Ethan knew. Time was a noose tightening around their necks, and that Lake Michigan trip was slipping further out of reach every day. They were broke, drowning in bills, and his dad's promise was just a ghost now, haunting them with what could have been. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat sharp as broken glass. He wasn't a kid who begged. Life had beaten that out of him. But this wasn't about pride. It was about John, about Sophie, about the one thing he could still fight for. His fingers flew across the keyboard, each word a desperate stab in the dark. My name's Ethan. My dad's my hero. He raised me and my sister alone, worked himself to the bone. Now he's dying, cancer, and we're out of time. He wants to take us to Lake Michigan one last time. We've got nothing. I'm begging. Help us. His heart slammed against his ribs as he hit post, the screen glaring back at him like a judge passing sentence. What if no one cared? What if it vanished into the endless scroll of the internet, just another kid's cry in the void? Hours crawled by, the clock ticking like a bomb. Nothing. No likes, no shares, just silence, thick and suffocating. Ethan's stomach twisted, doubt clawing at him. Maybe it was pointless. Maybe people didn't give a damn about a dying man and his kids. He buried his face in his hands, the weight of failure crushing him. Then, a buzz. His phone lit up. One notification, then 10, 50. Hundreds. His breath caught as the numbers exploded. Thousands of shares, comments flooding in. Hang in there, kid. Your dad's a fighter. We're with you. Ethan's eyes burned, hope flickering like a match in the dark. Strangers were rallying, their words a lifeline. But it wasn't enough. Words couldn't buy a trip. They couldn't stop death. He stared at the screen, pulse racing. This was going viral, a wildfire he couldn't control. Somewhere out there, someone big was watching, someone who could change everything. And in a sleek penthouse across the city, Mike Tyson's phone buzzed, his eyes narrowing as he read Ethan's plea. The game was about to shift. The Chicago skyline glittered like a jagged crown against the night, but inside John's crumbling apartment, the air was thick with despair. Ethan sat frozen on the couch, his laptop glowing with the wildfire of his viral post. Thousands of shares, a digital scream echoing across the city. His plea had clawed its way out of their suffocating little world, but it hadn't brought the miracle he'd prayed for. Not yet. John was asleep in the next room, his labored breaths a cruel metronome counting down the hours. Sophie's tiny snores drifted from her bed, her bear clutched tight, oblivious to the storm brewing. Ethan's hands shook as he refreshed the screen, the numbers climbing but the hope slipping. Strangers cared, hundreds of them. But caring didn't pay for Lake Michigan's shores. It didn't stop the cancer gnawing at his dad. The clock on the wall ticked louder, each second a hammer blow, and Ethan felt the walls closing in. He'd thrown their last lifeline into the void, and it was sinking. Across town, in a penthouse perched above the chaos of the loop, Mike Tyson leaned back in a leather chair, his phone buzzing like a hornet's nest. The ex-heavyweight champ scrolled through his notifications, his jaw tight, his eyes sharp as steel. His assistant had flagged Ethan's post, "You've got to see this, Mike." And now the words burned into him. A kid, 12 years old, begging for a dying father's dream. Tyson's fingers hovered over the screen, his breath catching. He'd seen pain before. Hell, he'd lived it. Knocked down in the ring, battered by life. But this was a gut punch. John's story wasn't just another sob story. It was a fight, raw and real, and it hit too close to home. His own losses flashed through his mind. Family gone too soon, chances he couldn't take back. He couldn't scroll past this one, not tonight. Tyson's voice cut through the silence of the room, low and gravelly. Get me their address, now. His assistant blinked, startled. You're serious? Mike's glare could have shattered glass. Dead serious. This ain't about a check. This is personal. The gears were turning, his mind racing. He wasn't just sending them to the lake. He was stepping into their ring, gloves off, ready to throw down for a family he didn't even know. Within hours, he had it all. John's name, their rundown building on the south side, every detail Ethan's post had spilled. He didn't call ahead. No warning, no fanfare. Tyson wanted the shock, the moment to hit like a knockout punch. The next afternoon, John dragged himself to the door, his body screaming with every step. The cancer was a beast now, clawing deeper, but a sharp knock jolted him upright. He wasn't expecting anyone. Maybe a landlord chasing late rent, maybe a neighbor with another empty condolence. He swung the door open, and the world tilted. Mike Tyson stood there, larger than life, his black hoodie shadowing a face etched with purpose. John's breath caught, his grip on the doorframe tightening as his knees buckled. You're, he stammered, voice a rasp. Tyson's lips curled into a half smile, but his eyes were deadly serious. Yeah, I am. Ethan's post found me, John, and I'm here to make that lake trip happen. Me, you, the kids. We're doing this. John's heart slammed against his ribs, disbelief warring with a flicker of something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. The champ wasn't just offering a lifeline, he was stepping into the fight of John's life. The wind off Lake Michigan whipped through the air, sharp and cold, carrying the tang of fresh water and the distant rumble of waves crashing against the shore. John stepped onto the sand, his boots sinking into the gritty expanse, his breath shallow as the weight of the moment crushed him. The cancer was a fire in his chest, relentless. But for the first time in months, it didn't own him, not today. Ethan sprinted ahead, his sneakers kicking up clouds of dust, while Sophie shrieked with delight, her tiny feet leaving a chaotic trail toward the water. The sky stretched wide, a bruised gray promising rain, but the horizon glowed with a fleeting defiance John hadn't seen in forever. He'd made it. They'd made it. And standing beside him, Mike Tyson loomed like a titan, his presence a thunderclap in the quiet chaos of their lives. You're here, man, Tyson said, his voice a low growl over the wind. This is yours. John's knees trembled, not just from the disease, but from the surreal weight of it all. Yesterday, he'd been a dying man in a South Side dump, counting minutes. Now, the lake sprawled before him, endless and wild. A dream he'd buried under bills, and doctor's visits roaring back to life. Ethan tackled the waves, his laughter cutting through the air like a blade, while Sophie spun in circles, her arms outstretched, chasing the wind. Tyson clapped a heavy hand on John's shoulder, steadying him as he staggered. Look at him, Tyson said, nodding toward the kids. This is what you fought for. John's throat burned, tears prickling his eyes. He hadn't fought, not really. The cancer was winning, round after round. But this was a knockout blow he'd landed against fate. The day unrolled in a blur of chaos and light. They built sandcastles that crumbled under Sophie's wild kicks, the towers toppling as Ethan raced to save them, shouting over the crashing surf. Tyson waded into the shallows, hoisting Sophie onto his shoulders, her squeals piercing the air as waves battered his legs. John watched, chest tight, as Ethan grinned, really grinned, for the first time in months, tossing a football with the champ like they'd known each other forever. The sun broke through the clouds, painting the water gold, and for a fleeting second, John could breathe. No hospital stench, no beeping machines, just the raw, living pulse of his kids, free and alive. He sank onto the sand, the cold biting through his jeans, and let it soak in. This was his victory, stolen from the jaws of death. But the shadow lingered. As the wind picked up, howling like a warning, John felt it. The ache deep in his bones, the clock ticking louder. The day was perfect, a fragile bubble of joy, but it wouldn't last. He locked eyes with Tyson, who gave a slow nod, understanding the unspoken. This wasn't just a trip, it was a farewell, and the reckoning was coming fast. The sun dipped low over Lake Michigan, painting the waves in streaks of fire and shadow, but the air turned heavy, thick with an unspoken storm. John sat on the damp sand, the cold seeping into his bones as the wind howled, a primal wail that matched the ache in his chest. Ethan and Sophie played nearby, their laughter a fragile thread stitching the day together. Sophie splashing in the shallows, Ethan tossing pebbles into the surf. Mike Tyson stood a few paces off, his silhouette carved against the horizon, watching the kids with a quiet intensity. The day had been a miracle, a stolen slice of heaven, but John felt the truth clawing up his throat like a beast he couldn't choke down any longer. The cancer wasn't just killing him, it was counting down to the moment he'd shatter his kid's world. He couldn't hide it anymore. Not after this. He called Ethan over, his voice cracking like dry timber. "Buddy, come here." Ethan jogged up, his cheeks flushed from the wind, but his eyes narrowed. Sharp, too damn sharp for a 12-year-old. John's hands shook as he gripped his son's shoulders, the weight of the words crushing him. "I'm sick, Ethan. Real sick." The boy froze, his breath hitching, the lake's roar filling the silence. "But you're getting better, right?" Ethan's voice was a plea, brittle and desperate. John's chest caved in, the lie he wanted to tell dying on his lips. "No, son, I'm not." The world tilted. Ethan's face twisted, confusion, fear, then a raw, gut-punched realization. You're gonna die?" The words hit like a gunshot, and John pulled him close, his own tears spilling hot and fast. "I love you and Sophie more than anything. Always will. But I need you to be strong, for her, for you." Sophie toddled over, oblivious, her tiny hands clutching a shell. "Daddy, look," she chirped, and John forced a smile, his heart splintering. Ethan's fists clenched, his eyes burning into the sand, and John knew he'd just handed his son a burden no kid should carry. Tyson stepped closer, his shadow falling over them, silent but steady, a rock in the chaos. He'd seen the shift, felt the air thicken with grief, but he didn't speak. Not yet. The waves crashed harder, relentless, as if the lake itself mourned what was coming. John held his kids tight, the warmth of their bodies a lifeline against the cold creeping through him. This was it. The truth laid bare, a wound that wouldn't heal. The day was theirs, but the night loomed dark and inevitable. Yo, hold up. Did this rip your heart out? Smash 6 in the comments and subscribe if you're rooting for John and the kids. Mike Tyson's next move is going to flip everything. Not vibing? Drop a like and tell us why. Want to know if Ethan steps up or breaks down? Share this now. Next part's dropping soon, and trust me, you won't see it coming. Who's Team Tyson? Let's hear it. The sky over Lake Michigan darkened, bruised clouds rolling in like a fist closing around the fading light. The waves roared, slamming the shore with a fury that mirrored the storm breaking inside John. He sat on the sand, Ethan pressed against his side, the boy's shoulders trembling with silent sobs after the truth had ripped through them. Sophie nestled into John's other arm, her shell clutched tight, her innocent hums slicing through the tension like a knife. The air was thick, electric. The weight of John's confession hanging between them. Cancer, terminal, no way out. Ethan's eyes were red, his fists balled in the sand, grappling with a reality too big for his 12 years. John's chest burned, not just from the disease, but from the guilt of unloading this on his son, a burden he'd carried alone until it was too heavy to hold. The lake stretched endless before them, a cruel reminder of time slipping away. Mike Tyson stood a few feet off, his broad frame a sentinel against the wind, watching the scene unfold with a jaw clenched tight. He'd stayed quiet through the gut-wrenching exchange, but now his boots crunched the sand as he stepped forward, his shadow swallowing the fading daylight. "John," he said, voice low and rough, cutting through the waves' thunder, "you're not done fighting yet." John looked up, his vision blurring with tears, confusion flickering in his hollow eyes. Tyson crouched, leveling with them, his gaze piercing. "I've been where Ethan's at, lost people, felt that hole. I'm not letting it swallow them." John's breath hitched, his grip on his kids tightening. "Mike, you've done enough. This trip—" Tyson cut him off, his hands slamming the sand for emphasis. "This ain't just a trip, man. It's a promise. I read Ethan's words, saw your fight. I'm in this now. When you're gone, they're not alone. I'll be there." Ethan's head snapped up, his tear-streaked face searching Tyson's, disbelief warring with a spark of hope. Sophie tilted her head, sensing the shift, her tiny voice breaking through. You'll stay, Mr. Mike. Tyson's eyes softened, but his resolve was iron. Every damn day they need me, kid. School plays, tough nights, whatever. They've got me. John's throat closed, the weight of Tyson's words crashing over him like the waves. He'd given his kids this day, this memory, but Tyson was offering something he couldn't, a future, a shield against the void he'd leave behind. You don't have to, he rasped, but Tyson shook his head, fierce. I do. You're their dad, John. No one replaces that. But I'll be their rock when you can't. The wind howled louder, the lake churning as if it felt the pact being forged. John pulled Ethan and Sophie closer, their warmth a fleeting anchor. He was slipping, the end rushing closer, but in Tyson's vow he glimpsed salvation. Not for him, but for them. The night loomed, cold and relentless, but for the first time, it didn't feel like the end. The Chicago air bit cold and sharp as dawn crept over the south side, the faint hum of the L train rattling through the stillness. Inside their cramped apartment, the silence was deafening. John was gone. The cancer had claimed him just days after the Lake Michigan trip, its final blow swift and merciless. Ethan sat on the sagging porch steps, his breath fogging in the gray light, staring at the cracked concrete where his dad's boots used to rest. Sophie huddled beside him, her bear dangling from one hand, her wild curls tangled from restless sleep. The house felt hollow, a shell stripped of its heartbeat, every corner echoing with John's voice, his laughter, his quiet strength. The fridge still held his last scribbled note. Love you both. Always. Ethan's fists clenched. The paper crumpled in his pocket, a lifeline he couldn't let go. Grief was a vice around his chest, squeezing tighter with every tick of the clock. But beneath it burned something else, his dad's love, fierce and unyielding, etched into that day at the lake. A shadow fell across the steps, heavy and deliberate. Mike Tyson stood there, his black hoodie pulled tight against the wind, his eyes carrying a weight that matched Ethan's own. He didn't speak at first, just sat beside them, his presence a wall against the chaos threatening to swallow them whole. Sophie leaned into him, her tiny frame seeking warmth, and Tyson's arm wrapped around her without hesitation. He's really gone, Ethan whispered, voice cracking the words, a jagged wound. Tyson nodded, slow and solemn. Yeah, kid, but he's not gone. That day at the lake, he gave you that forever. Ethan's throat burned, memories flashing, sandcastles crumbling, waves crashing. John's tired smile as he'd held them close. It was a gift, a piece of his dad no sickness could steal. Tyson's voice cut through the haze, low and steady. I told him I'd be here. Meant it then, mean it now. You're not facing this alone. Ethan looked up, eyes red but fierce, searching the champ's face. Why us? Tyson's jaw tightened, a flicker of his own ghost surfacing. 'Cause I know what it's like to lose everything and have no one step up. Your dad fought for you. I'm fighting for him. Sophie's small hand gripped his sleeve. You'll come back? Tyson's nod was ironclad. Every time you need me, Soph. Lake trips, late nights, whatever. I'm family now. The wind picked up, carrying the distant crash of Lake Michigan, a sound that tethered them to John's last stand. Ethan wiped his eyes, resolve hardening in his chest. His dad was gone, but his love wasn't. It lived in them, in Tyson's vow, in the waves they'd conquered together. The world felt fractured, the future a dark, uncharted sea. But as Tyson stood pulling them into a rough embrace, Ethan felt it, a spark of strength, a legacy unbroken. John had given them everything, and in the shadow of loss, they'd found a new anchor. The fight wasn't over,